Hi students, in this video I'm going to introduce what we're calling the conservative revival, and that's a change that we see in American society and politics that takes place in the 70s and the 80s. And in the past week we looked at the 1960s. We looked at how there's this generation of at least part of the baby boomers that's rebelling against social norms that had governed American life for much of the 20th century. And when we come to the 70s and the 80s, we see that there's a reaction against that rebellion, which we call the modern American conservative movement. A movement that emphasized a return and a promotion of older, more established social values, and a movement that promoted more limited government involvement in everyday life, so reaction against ideas like the Great Society and the New Deal, and a movement that emphasized being patriotic and being proud of being an American and being opposed to any kind of compromise with communism. They saw the 60s rebellion, these anti-war protesters from the Vietnam era, as in some way compromising their loyalty to America in favor of Marxism. And we see the conservative movement achieve its first electoral success in the election of 1968 that was won by Richard Nixon. He's partly able to win this election because he is able to flip the southern states, which previously had been reliable votes for the South, but for the Democrats, but which had been consistently more conservative part of the country than the other parts of the United States that were voting for the Democrats. Nixon is able to convince voters in these states to turn and to vote for him and establish a new base for the Republicans to continue or to return to government. And so Nixon comes into government. We see him pass some conservative legislation. In particular, there's his new federalism program, which instead of providing federal programs directly into the states, provided the individual states with federal money that they could use on their own initiative for their own interests. And this was praised by many conservatives as reducing the impact of the federal government into people's lives and overreaching the position of the states. Nevertheless, Nixon was also willing to promote and to sign and to enforce legislation and legislative agenda that was promoted by the Democrats. He supported the 26th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. He increased funding that went to Social Security, and he also established the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, designed to decrease pollution and to clean rivers and in the air in American cities. Nixon also had to deal with a phenomenon that's called stagflation. And that is the slowing down of the American post-war economy in the 70s and also to a certain extent in the 80s. Remember, after the Second World War, we see an explosion of American economic growth, or actually it really begins with the Second World War. So with the Second World War, we see an explosion of economic growth. Country comes out of the Great Depression, and after the war, that boom is sustained under Truman and under Eisenhower, and government projects and also American aid that's going around the world. In the 70s, that starts to change. You start to see countries like Japan and Germany, who are devastated by World War II, re-emerging as economic powerhouses that would compete with the United States on the world stage. So the United States is going to take a smaller share, a smaller percentage of foreign business than it had in the boom years after the war. At the same time, you see that the baby boomers are coming to adulthood. That means there's a larger percentage of the population that needs jobs than previously. And so you have a rising unemployment rate, even though the number of jobs aren't necessarily falling. And then lastly, you have a rise in energy costs. And this is an insight into how the world is changing at this time. The nation of Israel, which had been established with great contention in the Arab world, recognizes that it's about to be attacked and launches preemptive strikes on Egypt and on Syria. And Israel is winning this 6 days war with support from the United States, which consistently supported Israel throughout the second half of the 20th century. And Egypt responds to American support for Israel by working with OPEC. And that is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, largely based in the Middle East, those countries in the world that produce most of the oil in the world. Egypt works with OPEC and establishes an embargo on oil being imported to the United States. And so suddenly there's a shortage of oil, there's a shortage of energy in the United States. And this shows you how the United States is increasingly tied to the world economy, but that there are challenges associated with that the country is trying to surmount. And these are significant economic difficulties for the United States. And this is going to be a consistent theme in the 70s and 80s. The US presidents are going to be very successful abroad, but are going to have limited success at home because of this difficult situation. That people are not seeing their standards of living rise as quickly as they had in the 50s and to a certain extent in the 60s. Nixon sees great success abroad during the Cold War, in part thanks to his strategy of détente, which means a loosening, a lessening of tension with the Soviet Union. So after the Kennedy administration, the Cuban Missile Crisis, people realize how close to a full nuclear war they've come. And so instead, there starts to be this movement to de-escalate tensions in the Cold War, and a movement in the West to try and win the Cold War by economic might rather than the use of military force. And this is something, an agenda that Nixon pursues. And he does it somewhat to the surprise of most people. Most people expect Nixon as a conservative, as someone who is committed to defeating communism, at least rhetorically speaking, and who represented a section of the country that was most committed to defeating communism, that Nixon would harden tensions with communist countries around the world. But actually Nixon does the opposite, and he de-escalates tensions. In 1971, he officially recognizes communist China for the first time in its history. Relations are established between the United States and China. And this is established in great secrecy and then finally unveiled. It's a great triumph for Nixon. The Democrats are confused and the other people are confused as well. But what Nixon is doing here is driving a wedge between China and the Soviet Union. He is aware that the Soviet Union is an industrial powerhouse. He's aware that China has a huge population and is a rising power in the world, and he is trying to separate these two communist powers. And at the time, tensions were escalating between China and the Soviet Union, and so China was looking for an ally. And what Nixon also discovers, and perhaps anticipated, is that once he's established more friendly relations with China, the Soviet Union becomes concerned about China and the United States working together against the Soviet Union. And so the Soviets are also willing to come to the negotiating table and negotiate a better relationship with the United States. Now, the Cold War is still going on, but in 1972, we have the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT in its acronym. And this treaty is one of the first instances in which we see both the United States and the Soviet Union agreeing to limit their supply of nuclear weapons. And so this is the first time, one of the first times that we start to see the Cold War, the tension, the threat of violence, the threat of destruction of the Cold War starting to dissipate a little. And so these are Nixon's great triumphs in foreign policy, and these triumphs propel him to re-election in 1972. And then, as famously we know, his presidency crashes and burns as part in the Watergate Scandal. Watergate Scandal, which was when Nixon had ordered his political operatives to spy on his political opponents. And kind of bit by bit, this starts to come out. Nixon denies it, lies, and this makes the situation worse and worse. And eventually, the political pressure on Nixon becomes so overwhelming that he ends up resigning. He resigns in order to avoid being impeached. But by this point, he and his close advisors had got into all kinds of trouble by lying to investigators, by trying to resist pertinent evidence being revealed to investigators and to the press. And Nixon's great triumphs in foreign policy are forgotten because of this monumentous scandal. Now, it turns out that Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, had also been forced to resign and leave office because of charges of corruption. And so the new president, Gerald Ford, is one of the first presidents, if not, he is the first president, and perhaps the only president, who was never voted for on a presidential ticket. He never stood as president or vice president. And so he comes into power, he comes into presidential power in the middle of this political crisis, which he makes worse in many people's eyes by then pardoning Richard Nixon. And there's this sense that Washington is full of these corrupt insiders, and why has Ford pardoned Nixon? And this seems as though there's this elite group of politicians to whom the laws do not apply. And so there's this skepticism about Washington. There are efforts on the part of Congress to limit the power of the president. And this leads to Jimmy Carter being elected president in 1976. Carter, who presented himself as an uncorrupted outsider who could come in and clean up politics in Washington, D.C. as an honorable person. He may have been an honorable person. He ends up being an inefficient president. Partly, again, he's inefficient because Congress, after the Watergate scandal, is very suspicious of presidential power and is seeking to limit presidential power. And so Carter is unable to resolve the economic crisis of stagflation that is troubling the United States at home. Like the other presidents of this era, however, he does achieve some success abroad, or at least in foreign policy. And we see this in the Camp David Accords, where after this continued war between Israel and the other Middle Eastern countries, Jimmy Carter is able to successfully broker the first establishment of peaceful relations between Israel and an Arab nation of Egypt. And so once again, we see that an American president in the 1970s is able to achieve significant success abroad, at the same time as at home there's this economic stagnation that they're not really able to solve, and there are these worries about corruption and the highest levels of government.